Hello and welcome to another episode of the Walled Garden Podcast. So I recently had a conversation with two professors of philosophy from the University of Notre Dame. The names are Meghan Sullivan and Paul Blaschko. They recently co-authored a book called The Good Life Method, reasoning through the big questions of happiness, faith, and meaning. And in this conversation today, we really wrestle with these questions of, what is the good life? What does it mean to achieve happiness? How might we do that? Really grappling with a few of these core ideas that they expand upon in their book. So I highly recommend grabbing this book. I'm going to put a link in the show note to where you can get your copy. And before we dive into the interview, I am going to read you a little bit about Meghan and Paul, just so that you know who we're dealing with here. So, Meghan Sullivan is the Wilsey Family College Chair in Philosophy at the University of Notre Dame, the Director of the God and the Good Life program, and Director of the Notre Dame Institute for Advanced Study. She has published works in many leading philosophy journals. Her first book, Time Biases, was produced by Oxford University Press. Her work has been supported by grants from the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, and the John Templeton Foundation. Sullivan has degrees from the University of Virginia, Oxford University, and Rutgers University, where she earned a PhD in philosophy. So that's Meghan in a nutshell for you, and I want to tell you a little bit about Paul now. So Paul Blaschko is an assistant teaching professor in philosophy at the University of Notre Dame. He heads up curriculum design and digital pedagogy for the God and the Good Life program, and he's recently been working to develop similar curricula at universities across the nation as a part of an initiative funded by the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. Blaschko completed a Master in Philosophy at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, a PhD at the University of Notre Dame in 2018, and held the Andrew W. Mellon Postdoctoral Fellowship prior to being appointed to his current position. Alright, so there you go, that's Meghan and Paul for you, and I'm just going to dive into the conversation now because I know that you guys are going to get so much out of this. I don't want to take any more time, so without any further ado, I want to present to you guys the co-authors of the new book, The Good Life Method, Meghan Sullivan and Paul Blaschko. Meghan and Paul, I'm really grateful that you've jumped on with me today, and thank you so much for your work that you've released. Is it being released in January, by the way? That's what I've heard, right?
Yeah, January 4th.
Okay, wonderful. The Good Life Method.
The samples. This is what it's going to look like, which we discovered yesterday.
Oh, that is beautiful. Wow. Wow. See, I've just released my book as well, and I'm so glad to see your copy there, right? Because what I really love is when people recognize the importance in a book of the design as well. It has to be beautiful. It has to feel high quality as well. Hardcover, I love it. And it looks like you guys have put the care into that as well, which I love. Because why would you not want to wrap your book up if you've spent all this time and energy, and if you believe that it's important, why wouldn't you put it in something beautiful, right? So anyway, I'm going to throw it over to you both, and I will just give you fair warning. This often happens with my podcast recordings, but right outside, somebody has started mowing the lawn, and with their big whippersnapper as well. So if you hear that, I'm sorry, everybody, but maybe we'll start with you, Meghan. Why don't you just introduce yourself? Who are you? What do you do? And how did you get involved with Paul as well to write this book?
So I'm a philosophy professor here at Notre Dame. This is actually the 11th year that I've worked here. This is my first job out of grad school. And I got to know Paul actually when he was a visiting prospective graduate student. He came with his wife, Shayla, to campus. We bring all of our philosophy PhD students here on campus to walk around and see if this is really a place where they want to spend between 5 and 1 million years of their life. And Paul and Shayla were up here. It was right around like Good Friday, and they went to mass with me, and I got to talking with them and realized very quickly that Paul not only had some of the same philosophical interests and professional interests that I had, but also cared a lot about thinking about what it meant to teach at a Catholic university and thinking about what was really special about what we offered to our students. So it was a conversation that honestly started before Paul even got here on campus. And then he ended up coming to Notre Dame, was a teaching assistant for me in some of the big intro classes. And that's where this conversation got really serious of like, what would happen if we blew up the standard intro to philosophy as we taught it and started really trying to design a course that helps students think about the meaning of their lives. And that just kept growing and growing and growing. And here we are.
Yeah, and so Paul, maybe if you could just introduce yourself as well, and then maybe if you could transition into, this is a question I want to ask you as well. So Megan, you've mentioned that you're at a Catholic university. You also mentioned in the book that you're both practicing Catholics, I believe. I'm correct on that. So yeah, Paul, introduce yourself, and I'd also like to know how the Catholicism influenced the way that you approached this work.
Yeah, absolutely. So Paul Blaschko, I'm a teaching professor here in the department at the University of Notre Dame now. I guess, and kind of to pick up where Megan left off, which is perfect. When we started thinking about, okay, we want to change the way that students encounter philosophy for the first time, we went in a couple of different directions. One is, we really leaned heavily into making philosophy accessible to our students. And one way we did that is just through technology. So we have this course website for this course that the book is based on. That course is called God and the Good Life. And, it's to our mind, it's the easiest way to kind of jump into the ideas, to the arguments. We try to make sure that the texts that we're posting have hyperlinks so that students aren't going to be distracted by, the jargon and the philosophical terminology, and they're not going to kind of be discouraged by that. Because so much of philosophy, is encountering, Aristotle telling you, look, you've got a goal in life and it's to be happy. And here's exactly how, you might want to think about doing that. So one of the ways that we tried to make philosophy accessible was through technology. Another way, though, was by approaching it, and I think this is something that's characteristic of the sort of Catholic intellectual tradition, broadly speaking. I mean, this is a term that at least at Notre Dame we throw around all the time. But sort of approaching philosophy from the point of view of the whole human person, and asking, what does philosophy have to say for you in your everyday life? I'm the kind of person that in college and, ever since, when I have like a deep sort of problem, I first go to philosophy. I first think like, man, didn't like Aquinas have something to say about this? Or, Elizabeth Anscombe, or, Descartes was really worried about doubt. Like what's going on? And we wanted to bring that sort of energy to the classroom. We wanted to bring that to our students. Megan talks all the time about how much she reads the news, and she reads the news like 30 times as much as me. But I think we share this idea that philosophy shows up in the news all the time. And so, one thing we'll do is text back and forth like, oh my gosh, did you see that op-ed that just came out in the New York Times? Like, they're making all these metaphysical assumptions that they don't even recognize. And so, one part of this sort of whole person training is we'll post an op-ed, or we'll post a news article on our website each day that students are going to read. So they're reading, Immanuel Kant and The Atlantic. And one of the things we do in class is we walk in and we say, okay, what do these have to do with each other, right? And at first glance, it might seem like nothing, like I don't know what's going on here. But there's always a thread between those. And one of the sort of exciting things that we get to do is we get to say, not only is Kant showing up in this article, but it could show up in your life as you're thinking about, the role of honesty and whether that's a moral absolute or whether there are sort of boundaries and gradations and whatever it might be. So I'd say that's one of the distinctive ways in which we approach philosophy on Notre Dame's campus.
Yeah, I really like that approach, and it resonates really hard with me because I've certainly had the experience in my own philosophical development that the more deeply I've thought about these philosophical issues, the more it's as if philosophy starts to pervade every single part of my life. And just like you're saying, you read something and you think they're making a philosophical argument here, but they don't even know it and they don't even see it. And it's just so interesting. It started even happening with my art. I mean, when I started to realize that when I'm playing and performing music, or when I'm composing a piece of music, what I'm really doing is extracting the contents of my soul and presenting a philosophy through music or through poetry. But it's all I think the thing that I started to notice was when I'm doing music, when I'm doing poetry, when I'm doing podcasting, all of this is philosophy if it's aimed at the sort of questions that I'm trying to answer with those modes of practice. And so I really like that mode of teaching. And I wonder, there was one thing that you guys wrote about in the book where these ancients, they basically were trying to answer these three questions. Firstly, you had the question of, well, what is the purpose of a human being? What are we made for? Or essentially, what is our function? Then you obviously had, what is our aim? What's the highest thing we could attain? And then how do we get to that aim? I wonder, with your book, where are you starting from? What is that foundation of this is the function, or this is the purpose of a human being? This is the makeup of human being. Where are you starting from? What foundation are you building from?
So I can take a stab at this. In the book, we start off introducing Aristotle as their kind of mascot. He's the mascot for the class. And I think for both Paul and I, he's one of these philosophers that has repeatedly been our touchstone for trying to guide us through thinking about the rest of debates in philosophy. And Aristotle famously asked this question at the very beginning of his happiness course. He's like, before we can talk about how to be happy, which he promises we're going to get around to figuring out, we have to first figure out what our function is. What's the special thing that makes the difference between a good or a failed human? And humans are really special, unlike all the other animals, in that we can freak out about this question. We can worry about it every single day, whereas very rarely does a cat worry if it's a good house cat or not, at least as far as we know. So I think a lot of people read the function argument and think that's outdated or mystical. What does it mean? Think humans have a purpose in the era of quantum mechanics. Paul and I have never had that cynicism. I mean, even if you are still trying to get your head around some of these theories that religious traditions offer us about our meaning and our destiny, we still think ordinary people all the time are worried about whether or not they're living up to the kind of life that's possible for them, or whether or not they're falling short. And that's Aristotle's question, is let's pause and reflect and think about this, rather than just ramming our head against the wall every year when it comes time to form New Year's resolutions. I think for me, the investigation starts, and I'm a convert to Catholicism, so I actually had a bit more philosophy under my belt before the spiritual life really became alive for me. I think reflecting on what seems to be really special about us and the people that we love, this isn't to diminish animals or the natural world in any way, but to just say, what is special about my inner life? What's special about the kinds of goals that are most constant in my life? How do we elevate those, and how do we start to use that to get a grasp about what this kind of life is that I'm responsible for directing? And we oftentimes realize that we have some plans or some self-concepts that turn out to be really wrong. When I was 19 years old, I wanted more than anything on planet Earth to be a lawyer. That was the summum bonum of my life. And I'm so glad that I did not fulfill that destiny when I was 19, because it was a kind of shallow goal that I hadn't really thought that much about. Other goals, though, like being a really loving parent, like being somebody that over the course of a life feels like you've made an investment in a community that you really care for. Being somebody who has developed a natural instinct of appreciating all of the beauty around you rather than just, wandering and stumbling through life. Those are all the more constant goals that start to really give us a sense about what it is that we're meant to be doing, even if they're little fleeting grasps.
Yeah, certainly. And I think that it's really interesting to hear that you had the philosophical understanding before you came into the Catholic faith as well. That's something that I'd be very fascinated to hear about, because I think that we're living in a very strange time where for a long time, I seem to think like cynicism has actually taken over as the dominant philosophy in our culture, but not necessarily the cynicism you may have seen back in the ancient days, but just a general kind of dull outlook on life and not much faith in the human spirit. I wonder, Meghan, if you could just touch on for a second, I don't know, what was the point or what was some of those lines that actually drew you into finding faith when you were actually more philosophical, but then found your way in there? I'd be interested to hear about that.
Yeah, I mean, a little bit of philosophy can certainly be dangerous for a religious life as well. We try to wrestle with these difficulties in the book. For me, I was 18, 19 years old. It really happened over the course of about a year and a half, right when I had arrived at college. And at the time, I was one of these teenagers that had all of these huge dreams. I was working on college applications from like 10th grade onward. I had all these things that I really wanted. I wanted an excellent career. I wanted to get into the most competitive major. I wanted to be accepted by the most exclusive clubs in college. I was just like one constant driving, hungry machine when I was 18 or 19. And one thing that happened to me as I moved away, first, I'd always been kind of directed about the good life by my parents and my teachers. And when I went away to college, I felt really free to start to pick my own goals, but also immediately freaked out by how hard it was to decide what things were really worth all the time and energy and what wasn't. Another thing that happened was external. I arrived at college right when the planes hit the World Trade Center in 9/11 and was just thrust, like almost everybody else in my generation, into this really complex, really confusing and suffering understanding of the world. And I wasn't a particularly deep thinker when I was a first year in college, but everybody was talking about this constantly. I'd never been to New York, but I started thinking a lot of like, I wanted more than anything to have the jobs that the people that worked in that World Trade Center had. And that got me thinking, but oh my gosh, like life is short. You could tell I was going to become a philosophy major because I would really dwell on these questions, but like life is so fleeting, but we want these things and they're good things. I also started to feel like there were things that were just missing in my life. And this you can't really describe using philosophy. Paul and I talk about this a little bit in the book, but there are some of our deepest like wants and needs that we just have to pay attention to, but we can't rationalize because they're just super deep within us. And that was certainly how religious faith started for me at that time. I remember I was very curious about religions. I would like secretly check books out of the library and read them, looking for like deep insight. There was a Catholic church that was right near my dorm, and I would just notice it all the time. And I'd always be thinking, like, what are they doing in there? What's going on? The first anniversary of September 11th, I was thinking, I really want to be around people that try to make meaning out of these seemingly incomprehensible things. And I'd been eyeing the church for a little while. And so I went there kind of expecting philosophy. And I write about this a little bit in the book. I expected like some big, beautiful speech about suffering and the problem of evil. And instead, just found a couple people praying at like a daily mass service and got exposed to just a way of kind of being that I'd never really had exposure to before, and realized pretty quickly that that was something that was fulfilling something I was missing in my life. And that was like the beginning of the journey. It also helped that the people that ran that parish were Dominicans. So they were just totally primed and ready to receive a philosophy major. As soon as I started having questions, they were like, oh, we've got books. We can feed this. And I really appreciated that.
Yeah. Yeah, that's beautiful. And I have to say, that's one thing. I grew up as a Mormon, but then I left the church. But now, obviously I'm studying divinity, which is one of the reasons why I'm asking these theological questions, because to a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And that's where my head's going. But one thing I've really liked about exploring very simply the Catholic faith is their desire to have faith with reason, so like we need to be able to back up our arguments through a faith-based argument as well as a reason-based argument, and together we are strengthened. And their love of philosophy, I really appreciate that. Paul, I might bring you in here because there's something that maybe you could talk about that I learned in the book, and this was horrifying to me, but it was also not surprising, right? Which is to see that I think I'm getting this right. 80% of students today say that the goal of life is to get rich, or their ultimate aim in life is to get rich. Whereas back in the 70s, I believe it was flipped around, where it was we want to have a meaningful, rich experience in life. and as I said, it didn't surprise me, because you look around the world today and you can extract the aims of humanity by just watching what they do. I really like what Carl Jung said. He said, look at what a person reads, what they watches, where they spend their time. You'll get what their aim is. So how did that influence the way that you guys approach this book? And I guess, what did that teach you about the way that you needed to approach this book and teaching people in university as well?
Yeah, I think one of the things that strikes us just as college teachers, like as people who are seeing, these young people every day, is how open and interested and eager they are to grapple with big questions like the ones that we raise in our course and in the book, and how refreshing they find it, honestly. So this happens all the time in God and the Good Life. Students come in with this sort of operating system, like the one that you're describing, this kind of cultural operating system is how I think about it. And if we're thinking about it in philosophical terms, it's very much, what a philosopher would call the life of action that's been programmed into us. It's like, okay, all of your goals are kind of preset. It's like, getting into the best college you can get into, getting a job, getting as much money as you can, being in tropical locations as often as you can so you can post it to Instagram. Like, there are just all of these different goals that are just pre-programmed that honestly, like, are unsustainable. They're not fulfilling, as Aristotle sort of leads us into realizing in the Nicomachean Ethics. If you've always got an action-oriented goal and it's always serving some other action-oriented goal, this can't go on ad infinitum, right? You're going to hit the end, and that's what we call burnout, or that's what we call cynicism or nihilism. You think, well, nothing matters at all then, right? Like I've got the thing that I wanted more than anything in the world. I feel nothing. It's worthless. Nothing means anything. Okay, so our students, I think they've gone through those cycles, and they're very, I want to just sort of like pump up our students a little bit. They're amazing. They're amazing human beings, incredibly smart, hardworking, but they run into these problems over and over. And I think they are just desperate for an alternative. And they'll give you 15, 20 minutes, right, to kind of make your pitch. But they've been pitched so often that, like, if you can't kind of back it up fairly quickly, they'll be like, okay, we've heard this before. It sounds like, like a shoe commercial or something. We're not into it. And so for me, walking into the classroom and just being able to say, okay, like, who here wants to be happy? And everybody's like, is this a trick? Yeah, okay, I think I want to be happy. You're like, well, this is exactly what Aristotle would predict. And let me tell you why. And let me tell you what's surprising about that, right? Because Aristotle doesn't think, you want to be happy in this sort of, affective, sort of emotional way. Obviously, emotions are a huge part of happiness, and Aristotle realizes that. He's not crazy. But he doesn't mean, who wants to feel happy continuously until they die. He means who wants to achieve eudaimonia, right? He's got a special term for happiness. And that's a hard thing, and it's a complicated thing. And if we sort of do our job right with the students in that first day, they'll say, like, okay, I'll give you a semester. Like, we can kind of sketch this out and follow it through and see what that really consists in. And to me, that's the exciting work. I mean, and that's, what I really hope for from each of the readers of this book, is that they'll see there is an alternative view out there, and not just one. I mean, it's not just like Aristotle or bust. I mean, I don't know. That's kind of how I feel about it. No, there's dozens. There are dozens of alternatives out there that are wonderful, right? And that really do provide this kind of explanation stopper almost. Why am I doing what I'm doing? Well, look, here's some ultimate good that you can look at and reflect on and think, no, yeah, it makes sense to live my life sort of devoted to this thing. I can justify it philosophically. So, so for me, that's the kind of alternative piece. That's the kind of thing that we can sort of hold up and offer and say, like, yeah, I think this is what a lot of us are looking for.
And maybe we could wrestle with that term, eudaimonia. Sorry, that's my Australian pronunciation of the word, but because obviously this is something that we've wrestled with a lot on the podcast. A lot of people believe the term is better translated as flourishing. I have a hard time with the word happiness. I'll give you a perfect example right now. I've been really looking forward to this conversation with both of you. Pretty much as soon as we jump on this conversation, they start mowing and whippersnippering outside. It's loud, it's annoying. I sometimes I jump between listening to you and I think, frick, I just wish they weren't mowing outside, and I've got to keep on pressing mute. And so perhaps in this moment, I'm not necessarily happy about this, but is there something else that I could have? I believe that eudaimonia, perhaps as translated as flourishing, encompasses more of the virtues that can give you that in any moment you have access to the meaning. I can what am I trying to say here? I can come to terms with the fact that that's happening, and although I'm not happy about it, I can still engage in the moment, which is leading to a meaningful conversation. I can still employ duty and say, okay, well, I'm employing duty by pressing mute so that people don't have that annoying sound in the background. All these things that add to a flourishing experience that maybe doesn't necessarily include the haps. So I guess semantically, have you guys wrestled with that term happiness, and what does it mean to you? And perhaps, I just want to know, what do you mean by happiness? What's your definition there?
Well, this experience is certainly character building for you, Simon. And I learned the term whippersnippering, which alone makes this interview worth it. I think that this debate about how to understand happiness and these cultural defaults about how we understand it was a big reason why Paul and I were motivated to design the class and why we wanted to write this book. The way we approach this, at least in America right now, when you think about universities studying happiness or teaching courses on happiness, they're almost always in the vicinity of positive psychology. This feeling like happiness is this like subjective well-being, this feeling that you can report on a survey or report using an app, and you can tweak it by getting slightly more sleep or by arranging your day in a different kind of way or by teaching certain kinds of classes. And feeling good is really important. Like subjective well-being is an important part of being a happy person. Certainly folks who are suffering from depression or finding it impossible to access that good feeling anymore, their lives are not going well by any stretch of the imagination, and we should try to help. But there's this assumption that that's all there is to it. And we know that that's false. We know that you can learn how to tweak your feelings day to day, but still not be happy with the course that your life is taking. Or we might know that sometimes the world is going to throw a complicated moral problem at you. It could be a really big problem, like whether to leave your marriage as an adult or whether or not to quit your job. Or it could be a little problem, like whether to shout out your window at the whippersnipper guy. If you've only prioritized as your goal feeling a certain way, you're not going to have the resources to understand what you should do when you hit those big philosophical crossroads, which we all hit. I mean, they come at us at every kind of life that we lead. And so one of the things that we try to emphasize with our students, and that we wrote the book to try to give proof of concept to readers, is that you can expect a lot more from a theory of happiness, and that philosophy plays this incredibly important role alongside psychology and other kinds of modes of inquiry that get into the happiness business. Philosophy plays this role at helping us understand the goals that are really worth going after, and also preparing us for the fact that sometimes we might have to make some sacrifices that in the moment make us feel not so happy or make us not experience well-being, but are done in service of a bigger goal that we have for our lives. And philosophers have been wrestling with that question for 2,500 years.
I'll tag on if I can, just at the very end here. So something Meghan sort of reminded me of in our last interview, actually, that we talked to someone about some of these questions, was, Aristotle says in the Nicomachean Ethics that we shouldn't call any person happy until after they're dead. And his point here is that like there are a lot of things that can impact whether or not we think that you flourished as a human being, and that won't really come out until after you're dead. He even thinks like some of the things your kids can do, I mean, they can really mess it up for you, if they like, I don't know, like bring like shame to your name or something like that. But one thing that strikes me about that is that it totally unsettles this way of thinking about happiness as subjective well-being, or as the kind of thing that I have direct access to. Like, am I happy or not? Like, let me just think. And I'm like, nah, I'm kind of grumpy. No. And it makes it this bigger thing, this kind of life-shaped thing that I'm striving for, but that I do have a practical connection to. And as you were talking about your experience in the moment, I was obviously I assume some of this is in the background for you even, but I was reminded, I was putting the mind set of the Stoics, right? Who say, look, yeah, when you're facing some of these adversities, you could retreat to the inner world and you can reflect on these things that externalities can't influence, that the world can't take away from you, and that are constituents of happiness, right? You've got a virtue, persistence in the face of the whippersnippet. Sorry, now I'm just totally it's like telephone, but you've got that thing. Nothing can take that away from you. I guess you could lose it. You could give it up. You could lose focus on it. But by sort of returning to those bases, just like using those as touchstones, you can kind of remind yourself, right, of this journey that you're on. And that itself can reorient you and often actually has this beneficial kind of side effect, which is that you do get like the subjective well-being from that too, because you think like, things aren't so bad.
In full agreement there, that it's such an inward path where we have to look within. And I also really love this idea that you don't call somebody happy. I would also extend that to you don't call somebody wise. They don't proclaim wisdom until after they're dead. You look back at their life and you leave that up to the people who you influence to judge you. I think that's a really reasonable thing to aim at, I guess. But also, Megan, you touched on something that I found really interesting about the book as well, which is that you draw this line between, I believe, the surveyed life and the examined life. And oh my gosh, it really, I got it 100% because, we're so obsessed with these gadgets that can track our daily movements, where they're obsessed with these apps and these things that there came a point, because I worked in the fitness industry as a gym manager. And, I was all about the fitness tracking apps and the calorie tracking apps and the things that you put on your arm and you got to tick these boxes and stuff like that. And I came into philosophy through the personal development realm. And so you guys also talk about the fact that there are so many personal development, books out there today that come along and say, this is the way. No, this is the way. No, this is the way. But I started to realize, man, the philosophers back then, they did all of this infinitely better with infinite amounts of wisdom that you just don't see enough. And you start seeing all of these ideas that the personal development gurus are just recycling today that they figured out thousands of years ago. And I wonder if you guys could touch on this, because I've been thinking lately, I actually think that part of the reason why there is such a renaissance of philosophy coming up today is perhaps even in response to the fact that the majority of people believe that the goal of life is this hedonistic kind of, I want money, sex, drugs, all this sort of stuff. Like give me that kind of life. That's what I want. Because Stoicism, even, like I've spent a lot of time in this realm, and it's a very ascetic philosophy. I mean, it's not easy to be a disciplined Stoic. They want you to do all these hard things that are going to train your soul and body to be under your control, you might say. And that's not an easy path. And I've often thought, is the fact of this resurgence of Stoicism almost a culture-wide consciousness shift, saying, we actually are going to respond to this hedonistic lifestyle by saying that's not what we want, and that's not what's meaningful. We're going to go over here. I wonder, have you guys noticed this resurgence of philosophy in our modern times? And what do you think are some of the reasons why? You might even find it in your students. What are the reasons why your students are coming to you and saying we want to spend our lives in philosophy?
Yeah, I'll jump in. I think last Christmas, Paul and I are both gym rats. We both go to the same local gym in town, and I'm a sucker for all the gadgets. I got my Apple Watch right here. Last Christmas, I got this close to buying a Whoop strap. I don't know if you have this in Australia, but this is like the new fitness tracker. And I bring this up because they have this commercial that they started airing last year called like Know Yourself, like know thyself, like Socrates. And the way you know yourself is by collecting all this data using this heart rate tracker. And I was just ripping my hair out. That's why I didn't buy it ultimately, because I was like, this is an insult to my way of life. But you think, I read the Socratic dialogues and read Plato, and you see this exact same dynamic that we see playing out in our culture today. Socrates goes around and he's talking with people about what their aims are in life. And he always finds some people who are like, happiness. I just want to feel how I want hedonic value. And pretty quickly, Socrates gets them to realize that it's self-defeating. Like they're by going so hard after feeling good, they end up actually not feeling great because they're not doing the kinds of things that are going to build themselves up into the kind of person who's capable of the right kinds of feelings. And you see this going right now. Paul and I obviously attract the students that already have a bit of that philosophical bug. I suspect you do as well. So there could be a little bit of selection bias in who seeks out philosophical advice. But we find so many people who think going fitness tracker after fitness tracker after fitness tracker is not, in fact, getting me tangible changes in my life. Or they experience whiplash. Like, I was supposed to be on this diet a couple of years ago, and now we're supposed to be on this diet. I was supposed to be raising my children this way, but now I'm supposed to be doing it totally differently. One of the things that's beautiful about this tradition of virtue ethics that comes up from the Greeks and the Romans all the way till now is that they're always building and riffing and modifying on wisdom from the previous group. They're bringing their own experience, the own kind of times that they had to live through in as evidence about what a good human life is. But they're not trying to reinvent the wheel. At least not the kinds of philosophers that Paul and I really love to teach. They're always modifying it or adding a wrinkle or adding a new chapter. And that also gives you the sense of like, well, my gosh, if this thing has this kind of staying power for all of these, centuries up until 2022, maybe it's got something that's going to be valuable in 2022, especially if these other options are not delivering the goods anymore. And I think especially after the last 2 years and the really strange period we find ourselves in, we start to realize that that smart watches are not going to be enough for the kinds of tasks that we're up against in our lives.
Yeah, certainly. And I think it's just such an interesting part of our current time, right? It's this obsession with gadgets and this obsession with adding things to us, but it seems like the philosophers were really saying, now get rid of all that and just go deeper within, and I think the way I've often thought about this is you look out into the world around you and you can see that it's complex and there's a lot of stuff to wrestle with and there's beauty everywhere and there's strange things everywhere. But then you close your eyes and you look within, it's like, oh my gosh, it's just as complex, if not more. It's just as interesting, if not more, because who knows where all these thoughts are coming from and how they appear here and how we grab onto them. And it's just such an interesting thing to see that they were really after this inward journey that ends up changing the outer world, right? It ends up actually changing everything external as well. I wonder, so you're obviously wrestling with a lot of these ancient philosophers that everybody would most people would know: Aristotle, Socrates, Plato, some of the Stoics. Who are some philosophers that you think don't get enough credit today for the contributions that they made?
Megan knows who I'm going to say. Can I
know
say
this? Paul's been waiting for this question.
So
sit down, kids.
I'm a huge fan of Elizabeth Anscombe. And she's a 20th century philosopher. She studied with Wittgenstein and actually is the best translator of some of his work to this day. And she was just a fascinating philosopher and actually part of a fascinating movement that sometimes is referred to as the Oxford Women's Movement. She and Iris Murdoch and Mary Midgley. There's at least one other philosopher that I'm forgetting right now. But they were very active, around the sort of early 20th century, and especially in ethics. A couple of really interesting sort of facts about Elizabeth Anscombe. So around that time, a lot of the philosophers who were in the department were serving in the military, were serving elsewhere. And so they came back from war and they had this consequentialist mentality. They thought like, look, something's good if it gets the good result, right? And this is, a lot of the times the way that we think about public policy or we think about ethics in war. And Anscombe thought this was absolutely monstrous. She thought like, we cannot start down this path, or ethics, the things that we believe are just going to get hopelessly distorted. And so she wrote what, Donald Davidson has called the best treatment of action since Aristotle. I'm really trying to like sell Anscombe to you in response,
well, you're doing a good job.
response to this movement, right? And so here's like one particular story that kind of captures her sort of feistiness. Harry Truman was being invited to Oxford to get an honorary degree. And she, looked around and she said, why would we give an honorary degree to Harry Truman? He committed mass murder, right? Like there's dropping the atom bomb was mass murder. And everyone kind of looked at her and said, look, like, just, chill out a little bit. Like, don't get so political. And so she wrote up a pamphlet and she said, look, it's very clear that what matters when you're making an ethical decision is not just the consequences, just, the question, did this end the war or not? But what matters is your intention. Like, what did you intend to do? And she said, when it comes to dropping the atom bomb, Harry Truman intended to kill innocent civilians in order to bring about some end that he desired, the end of the war, right? So she thought, like, this is just like, this is what my views demand of me. Like, I've got to stand up and make a fuss. And she did this, all the time. She was a sort of fiercely conservative Roman Catholic, but incredibly politically active at the same time. She was constantly getting arrested. She was also really good friends with Iris Murdoch, that we read about in the Love chapter, and who had diametrically opposed views on any number of issues, and they were constantly arguing. Last story I'll tell about Anscombe, one of my favorite stories about her. But so she was I think this is in New York. I don't know. This is one of those philosophy stories that we're just kind of making up at this point, but it is true. The core of it's true. She's in New York, and she walked into this restaurant. It was a fancy restaurant, so women were supposed to wear dresses, and they said, "Ma'am, I'm sorry, like, you're wearing pants. Like, women are not allowed to wear pants in this restaurant." She said, "Okay." She starts taking off her pants, and I'm like, no, it's fine. You can stay. It's just even the way that she just like thinks about this and just uses this, pure sort of like, modus ponens, modus tollens. Okay, that's fine. I love Anscombe. I think she's absolutely phenomenal, and somebody that we could, do well to pay more attention to.
She sounds almost like a kind of Fran Lebowitz-esque kind of character. I don't know, just like...
I would love to see like an HBO series about her life. I don't know.
Yeah. So Anscombe, you said.
Yeah, Elizabeth Anscombe. So it's Anscombe.
Oh, Elizabeth Anscombe. Okay. Yeah. Very interesting. Yeah, I'll have to check out her work. And Megan, I'm not sure if you have anyone who you'd like to add to the list, or...
Yeah, so one of Anscombe's friends has become one of the most important virtue ethicists for me, Iris Murdoch, who comes out a very, very different kind of woman. She also taught at Oxford after the war when virtue ethics was having this huge resurgence. Murdoch was a novelist and also dabbled in philosophy, but really thought about philosophy much the way somebody does. He spends a lot of their time imagining the minds of other people. Unlike Anscombe, Murdoch tried out many different religions over the course of her life and was always kind of bouncing around trying to find a way of life that suited her. But the reason I love her is she writes very beautifully about the role of attention and love in our good lives, which is something contemporary philosophers who work in moral theory almost never talk about this, or certainly they don't talk about love as much as the rest of us do when we're trying to lead our ordinary moral lives. And Murdoch really argues forcefully that we have to take this very seriously. And in one of her essays, she talks about this process we can use to try to improve how we care about other people without doing anything to them. She talks about how this mother has a hard time loving her new daughter-in-law. She just, outwardly, she's very polite to this woman and she wants to have a good relationship because she's worried if she doesn't, she'll alienate her son. But inwardly, she just doesn't like this woman. And she works on herself by causing herself to keep looking at this woman in new ways, to try to keep imagining her in different ways until she can find a way to pay attention to her in a loving way. And she does, and she makes progress. And Murdoch is like, we always measure how well we're doing philosophically or as moral agents by all of the changes that we're making in the outer world. But what about the work that we do in our inner world? I think she just makes that idea, which philosophers have talked about for 2,400 years, seem really vivid. And anybody who's like coming off of the holidays when they've been stressing out about loving a particular family member realizes like, that's a kind of philosophical therapy that I might do well to try. So I think Murdoch deserves credit too for kind of resurrecting a certain form of Platonism that really cuts to the quick at an area of the good life where a lot of us struggle.
Yeah. That is beautiful. And you mentioned that Murdoch wrote about attention as well. I wonder, I used to spend a lot of time listening to people like Gary Vaynerchuk, this just genius of social media, and so he's just the social media guy. And one thing that he constantly would say is that attention is the new currency. And it wasn't until recently that actually started to horrify me, because essentially what that means is that everybody out there is bidding for your attention, and they'll pay a few cents to get 3 seconds of your attention, and then this other company is paying for a minute of your attention, and everybody is bidding for your attention constantly. But really, it's our most valuable asset is our attention. And I feel like, on one hand, you say, okay, well, we have access to more philosophy than we've ever had in history right now. You can go and you can search any philosopher and you can probably get most of what they said for free, and you can read it and you can engage with it. On the other hand, our attention is being competed for by companies, by individuals, by apps, by watches, whatever it is. These companies are finding every way they can possibly find to get our attention on them. Do you think that? How do you think that this affects the ability of modern people to actually engage in the philosophical, examined life when so much of our attention is being drawn out? Do you think that because there's so much philosophy, it's easier today? Or do you think that because there's so much a grab of our attention, it's way harder today?
I think I think about this problem a lot because I'm a Facebook addict. And as Paul said, I spend all day just reading the news and having feelings about it. I think it's always been hard. Life has always been busy and demanding. If it's Facebook grabbing your mind in 2022, then in 1022, it was worrying about life or death issues for keeping your children alive, or whether or not this particular animal is thriving or not. It's always been just hard to contemplate and hard to take a step back. That's why the ancients write so much about whether or not certain people, the way they have to live their lives, are going to be prohibited from ever doing philosophy. I think the part of the answer to this question is not thinking that the cure for living in a really hectic time where lots of things outside of you are trying to grab your attention, that the cure for that is retreat and just finding a way to spend 2 days a week alone reading the great works of history by yourself. That's not a live option for a lot of people. And in fact, that makes the stakes of building philosophy and contemplation into your life way too high. I think we don't talk too much about Confucius in the book, but every time I read the Analects, I note that he just has all these little sayings. His philosophy happens in little bite-sized pieces. It's the same with Marcus Aurelius and actually a lot of the Stoics. Little bite-sized pieces that are meant to prompt you to contemplation, maybe break you out of your cycle this particular day, the way a tweet could. But instead of drawing you into the fight of the moment or an advertising campaign, they draw you up into philosophical insight or the chance to grow a little bit morally or the chance to notice something in another person or in the world. And I think that philosophy can have that kind of bite-sized role in our really busy lives if we're not able to achieve the monastic ideal. So I do think that this attention problem is one that just humans seem to be always facing, and it keeps morphing into a different kind of problem. So every time we learn a good strategy for working around it, it starts to grab us a different way. But I also think that philosophers owe it to people who are trying to navigate a good life in a technologically saturated world to remind people that they have a lot of middle options for starting to build up the contemplative muscle in their brains.
Yeah. And so I think you're right that it's always something that we have to wrestle with. I guess to me, it just seems like today we do live in a world where, there are billions of dollars being thrown at the goal of catching people's attention. Sometimes I even wonder, and you guys might see this more than I do, but I once was thinking about, maybe eventually I work my way up to, say, a doctorate in philosophy or something. I was wondering, what are the main jobs that people go into after a doctorate of philosophy? And I saw that one of the main jobs for a doctorate of philosophy was actually going to be a data analyst. So, these giant companies are hiring the smartest, most brilliant minds of our culture to then analyze and mine this data and tell them how they can get people to spend 5 seconds more on their app or on their widget or on their product. That horrifies me. It makes me lose faith in humanity. But I maybe going to something a bit more on a positive light now. One thing that I found really beautiful about your book is that you, with the general atheistic tendencies of our current culture, it would be easy to write a philosophy book and to not even mention God and just to stick to the very practical, here's how you live a practical philosophical life. But one of the parts of the good life method is wonder about God. And I really like that. And I like that you didn't say find God. It's like wonder about God, or, as the Israelites, Israel means wrestle with God. I love this idea, and I wonder if you could just expand a little bit on why you thought that was a very important part to put into this good life method.
Yeah, I can start here if you want. So I think, one of the themes of our class, one of the themes of the book is that, when it comes to philosophy, as important as it is to argue about the big questions, and it is important, we think it is really important to be very clear about why you think what you do and how somebody could disagree with it. It's equally important to care about the right sort of goal in philosophizing, to genuinely love the truth. I mean, there's a reason why in the Republic, Plato gives us not an argument or not just an argument against sort of sophistry and against argument for its own sake, but he gives us an image. He gives us this metaphor of, a prisoner trapped in the cave coming to realize that everything, he's seen up until that point is just a shadow of the real world. And then sort of walking out into the sunlight and realizing there's so much more here. The kind of feelings that stirs up in you, and just think like the truth is something that's worth pursuing. This is just, a big part of our commitment. And so when it comes to faith, one thing I've noticed in our class, and of course we're teaching in a very particular context at a Catholic university. But one thing I've noticed in our class is that our students and anybody that I talk to about the class, there is a deep curiosity about God, about religion, about spirituality. And it's one that, it's not an idle curiosity. It's something that people worry about, that sort of affects the way that they live their life and that changes decisions that they make. So one of the things in the book that we were able to do is sort of draw on that curiosity and say, look, here's some, phenomenal thinkers throughout the history of philosophy who have offered us really rigorous arguments. Thomas Aquinas gives us this argument that a necessary being has to exist. And at first you think what is a necessary being? What does metaphysics have to do with this? You walk through the proof and you think that is cool. That is amazing. One of my favorite chapters is the one on the problem of evil and suffering. And there again, I think there are just different ways that you can approach these questions. You can approach it like Kierkegaard approaches questions of faith, in fear and trembling, wondering am I doing this right? Am I seeing faith, in the right sort of way? Am I really understanding God and who God is? And am I rightly positioned, in light of those facts? So, for me, that was certainly one of my favorite parts, especially in the second half of the book, where we kind of turned from just the good life to this question of God and the good life, just wrestling with these issues that I really do think are incredibly common. I think a lot of people think about them. They just think about them often using different language and in different ways, but really are invested in trying to figure this out for themselves.
Yeah, Megan, I want to jump to you quickly, but also I just want to add something. I mean, I like that you mentioned this kind of fear and trembling in relation to the question of God, because I've certainly noticed that the deeper I've gone into my study, or probably more my introspective work, thinking about the nature of God, if there is a God, that sort of stuff, I think that has been accompanied with a deeper and deeper sense that everything that I do and the questions that I ask are really, really, really important. and so like everything's on the line, like, and I think that's introduced me to this idea that the fear of God is the beginning of wisdom, because if you truly, like, if you really ask these questions, you have to take it with a degree of seriousness and with a degree of this understanding that it really matters if you come to truth or not, or if you can get closer to truth or not. But I don't know. I want to throw it over to you, Meghan. Like, what's been your experience with the reasons why you might introduce people to this idea of wondering about God?
I think one thing I've discovered teaching philosophy or just having philosophical conversations with friends that are willing to go with me long enough is you start with, when you enjoy philosophy, you start doing it about mundane things. How much money should I give to charity? It starts to draw you out a little bit more. Should I feel like really responsible for accidentally forgetting to pick you up from the airport? That kind of gets you into morality, and the questions start to get then bigger faster. So if you say like, well, why do I care so much about working so hard? Well, it's so that I can pay for a great college for my kid. Why do I care about my kid going to college? Well, I want them to have a happy adult life. What do I want them to do for their job? Eventually it gets down to, how do I deal with the fact that everybody I love is going to die someday? It gets heavy fast if you're willing to stick with the philosophical beats. And one of the things that Paul and I have discovered while teaching is that by the time we get to week 5 or 6 trying to do even just ordinary practical philosophy with our students, you have to start handling these big questions. Why do we suffer? Why is our life full of so many accidents that can derail our best plans, or somehow strangely make people who are undeserving have access to happiness and fortune that we could only dream of? I think those get you into questions about what it means to live in a world with God or without God. And you start to want a more authentic, well-reasoned answer to some of those questions in order to have the resources to go back and make sense of all the little simple day-to-day life questions. Paul and I also share at the pivot point in the book, and we share this with our students, this really moving story from Stephen Colbert. He's a comedian. Nobody thinks of him as kind of like a Bible thumper by any stretch of the imagination. But he's somebody for whom faith has played a really important philosophical shaping role in his life. And he gets questioned about it all the time, as his father and 2 of his brothers were killed in this tragic, very preventable plane accident when he was a kid. He's been exposed to evil and suffering, the kind that's life-altering. And now he's super famous. He'll get these interview questions about how he dealt with that. And he talks about how throughout that painful episode in his life, and even afterwards, for him and for his family, it's been really important to think that there's some good in the world that's out there that's big enough to be grateful for, even for all of the complex, messy things that have happened in his life. And that this urge to gratitude makes him wonder what on earth could be the subject of all of this gratitude and feeling of joy for his life. And you totally know he's telling you the truth about it. I mean, he's this very joyful guy, somebody that's clearly loving his life and what he's doing. And the fact that he feels this way calls out for a certain kind of explanation, and that draws him into thinking about religious questions. I think a lot of times philosophers of religion sometimes think that God is like going to be the philosophical question ender. Like once you add God into the metaphysics, then suddenly it's clear why you do everything else and all of the philosophical pieces fall into place. And I won't speak for Paul, but as a philosopher, that's never been the case for me. In fact, I think once you start to ask those really big questions, is there a God in the universe? If so, what do I owe him? And why is he allowing these things to happen in my life? That makes you want to do a whole lot more philosophy. It can be disorienting and confusing, but it's the kind of confusing and disorienting that you also know is really healthy. I think for me, it's like, when you exercise a lot, you get sore a lot. And that's how it's working because you're suddenly paying a lot more attention to muscles that you were ignoring before. And I think likewise, you do a lot of philosophy. You start thinking about these God questions a lot. And it's not always going to be easy, but it's directing your attention towards things that are then going to be extremely fruitful for building up the rest of your philosophical worldview.
Yeah. Disorientating and confusing is exactly the word. They're exactly the words that I think are appropriate in this case. I almost feel like, similar to you, the deeper you go into these kinds of questions, and mine has been less of the kind of standard philosophical approach. I think it's been more of the artistic and poetic approach to wrestling with these questions. But I feel like I'm fragmenting, but at the same time, those fragments are still linked to a core thing that is pulling me upwards toward these questions. And so it can be disorientating and confusing. But there's a feeling that it's important that you continue on that path of questioning. I want to be respectful of both of your time. This has been such a beautiful interview. I just have one more question if you could both answer it. And I was just thinking, we often talk, and you talk about this in the book as well, that the fact that philosophy means love of wisdom. But what is wisdom to each of you? I'd love just your brief or long little. What is wisdom to you? What is the thing that you're loving and seeking?
Oh man,
easy.
I got you on this last question.
I love it.
Soft pulls until now, huh?
I don't think I have enough of it yet to be able to tell you. And probably once you have it, you can't really explain it to other people what it is. But I will say, and I think about Aristotle often, we find ourselves in a very difficult time. Or I don't know what's going on in your life, Simon. I feel like a combination of pandemic, very confusing world, increasingly difficult job, like family members who always have things they need from me. There's all kinds of like curveballs the world throws at us. Wisdom is something that you cultivate over time where even if you're getting a brand new kind of problem, you can put it into context almost effortlessly or pretty quickly. You can know the right way to feel about it. You can know what kind of problem it is. You can remember other times in your life where you've navigated it and who you can recruit to help you with it. And these don't just have to be practical problems like how exactly I'm going to get to Virginia in a week, though wisdom totally helps with that. But also like, even big abstract problems. Like, I've never tried to build this kind of system before, but I have an inkling it's like this other kind of thing that I've seen or dealt with before. And you put the pieces together. Philosophy has always been about kind of making connections and joining circles and being able to get to enough of a high enough perspective where you can see connections that otherwise you'd miss if you hadn't been trying to cultivate that vision. And here I totally agree with Aristotle that it's a kind of like habit that you get through experience. It's not something that you can really quickly translate to somebody who hasn't had the experience of trying to solve and reason through problems and then go back and look and see if they did a good job. But it's the kind of thing that over a well-lived life, if you see enough, then it starts to be just ingrained in you, and these problems don't feel so much like crises anymore.
Yeah, I love it. And I'm wondering, Paul, do you want to tackle it as well?
Yeah, sure. So I was really struck a second ago when you talked about encountering philosophy through art and literature. This is something I certainly find in my own experience as well. And one of my favorite experiences is reading a novel or even a short story, and you encounter a detail that is just permanently then going to restructure the way that you see the world. It names an experience in life, and it names sort of a truth about it. Right. So, different critics have talked about this as like sort of making things uncanny or sort of making things strange in a way that helps you see the world afresh. Okay. So one of the things that I'm struck by in the Nicomachean Ethics and just in Aristotle is, he's actually very particular about who's allowed to take his class on happiness, right? He says, like, I'm not going to let the young people take this class because, like, they're just going to argue about a bunch of stuff. They're going to talk about theories that they have no idea, like, what's going on. If you're going to take my class, you've got to, be at least like at midlife or beyond. You have to have some experience under your belt. And that always struck me as hilarious. I would tell this to my students. It's like, yeah, see, Aristotle wouldn't even let you in the door. But as I've gotten older, and I'm not even that old, I don't know. As I've gotten older, one thing I've noticed is that these bits of sort of like illumination, these little bits of understanding are things that people around me have. They just like contain them, especially older people with experience. And whereas, up until this point in my life, I was a philosophy major and then I was a philosophy graduate student. I was constantly looking to the smartest people and the, most advanced theories and the whatever else. Even when I'm asking sort of deeply practical philosophical questions, I've now come to just appreciate that regular people who deal with these, day in and day out, these same sort of practical issues and problems have oftentimes worked through them in experience in a way that can let them speak to some truth that I just had, have no sort of access to. So simple, very brief example, and not to bring the conversation down, but when my grandpa was dying, this is a while back, I went and visited him in the hospital, and my grandpa, like the sort of kind of guy that he was constantly throwing a party. Like he was just always having people over, always drinking alcohol, always playing cards. He loved having fun. He loved having these parties. And, growing up, I loved it, but I never really sort of like looked up to him as this like sort of wise figure or anything like that. Well, the last conversation I had with him, I was talking to him, I was kind of nervous. I was like, well, what do you think, Grandpa? And he's like, I'm not really afraid to die. And I was like, oh, that's a huge relief. Like, I don't know what I would have said if he was like, I'm terrified. He's like, I think the religious stuff's all true. And I was like, okay, good. Like, where's this going? And he goes, but one thing that I will say is I don't want to leave yet because you guys are having such a good party. And I just don't want to leave the party yet, right? And to think, in my mind, it just sort of replayed on the bus all the way back to South Bend and across the years, it sort of to see life as a party, to see other people as guests, as people that you can sort of offer some hospitality to, that you can enjoy life with and just sort of be friendly with. That strikes me as deeply right. That strikes me as like just deeply wise. And from, again, the most unlikely source of all. So I would say, I search for wisdom oftentimes in the lived experience of especially older people around me, much to their chagrin. Sometimes I'm constantly like interrogating my parents when they come to visit. I'm like, tell me wisdom, but that's what I would say. I would say that that's a bit of wisdom, or that's a source of wisdom that I really take seriously.
Yeah. Yeah, beautiful. Well, I want to thank both of you for coming on the show. This has been so much fun for me, and I hope we get to do it again as well. I'd really love that. I wonder if one or both of you could just tell us where can people get the book? When's it going to be released? Go ahead.
All right. So January 4th, you can get the book. It's called The Good Life Method by Meghan Sullivan and Paul Blaschko. And you can go to our publisher's website, Penguin Random House. I know it's at Barnes & Noble, Target, Amazon, wherever books are sold. You're indie bound, you can go to IndieBound, go to your independent bookstore. So I'm sure it's Googleable.
Beautiful.
If you have any confusion at all, email us and we will send you all of the links.
Heck yeah. Yeah, I'm sure you
There's
will.
There's an audiobook too. So if you want to listen to it in your car or on flights too, it's on Audible.
Wonderful. Well, yeah, thanks so much again, guys. This has been a lot of fun, and we're definitely going to do it again.
All right. Thank you so much.
Simon.
You've been listening to the Walled Garden podcast. For more episodes just like these, or to join our community, go to thewalledgarden.com. See you there.